Brooke Thompson.
Thank you. This guy. Pass those in the back. Doug, the covenant of service. Just pass them to the non-members. Oh. Good evening, everybody. They're going to be passing around the covenant of service to those non-members. I don't know if I have enough flyers. So if you're a member, pass it on to a non-member. Need to get this closer.
Take up the mic.
Hopefully that's better. Okay, so many people in exchange to thank, but at the...
Pick up the mic and hold it to your mouth.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, there are so many people in exchange to thank, but at the very least I want to thank 5 people. David, who just spoke, Camille, who is our president. David and Camille are involved in so many different activities and do an excellent job with them. Pete and Doug, as to this event behind us. Last year they put it together. This year they put it together. Obviously, you know Pete Olson, or you should know him. If you don't, get connected on his Facebook page. He's made some great posts about this event. And Doug is an amazing man. And last but not least, as far as having they've had their fingerprints on this activity. Nick is going to have his fingerprints on anybody who potentially vandalizes this place. He's been here the past several nights. We'll be here through Tuesday, pulling graveyard duty. So let's give them all a great hand. So I'm grateful to give this quick historical talk about Sugarland. It's ultimately a speech about this town and Imperial Sugar. It does actually weave in Galveston, which is so critical in the history of Texas and gives ample history in the philosophy of my great-grandfather Harris Kempner and his older son Isaac, otherwise known as Ike. They were both instrumental in the economic development of this area and ultimately the cultural and spiritual development as well. So I'm incredibly proud to be a part of the lineage. Before I begin, as far as to this speech, I'd like to give thanks to different historians, Bob Armstrong, Natalie Ornish, and Lydia DePellis. A special thanks, a very special thank goes out to my cousin Shrub Kempner. He's still alive. He's been diligent keeping track of these family records over the decades, and he's provided me gobs of ideas and materials to work with. As to the history, before the Civil War in about 1820, Stephen F. Austin was given a charter by Spain to bring 300 American families to this area, and he relied heavily on his valued assistant by the name of S.M. Williams. Mr. Williams saw the land here as very productive in harvesting sugarcane, and so he started doing so. More pertinent to Texas history, legend has it that Santa Anna marched his 600-man army in pursuit of Sam Houston's army right in front of the refinery over there by Oyster Creek. So there you go. Back to the family, my great-great-grandfather Harris, as a teenager, he was a highly observant, actually Jewish young man in what's modern Eastern Poland, which is modern-day Belarus. As a general tidbit, that part of the world is well known for the Fiddler on the Roof story. However, life was not very romantic there at all. Everyone was pretty much under the strict control of the Russian Orthodoxy. He faced a very bleak future as a Jewish teen, as he most likely would have faced serious hazing, if not death, as the army was inducting young teenagers his age at that time. So he departed down to the port town of Odessa, which is in modern-day Ukraine, and boarded a ship for the States. He landed in New York, where, like many other immigrants during the 19th century, he relied on groups like Exchange to get acclimated to this new country and simply learn the new language of English. Soon thereafter, Southeast Texas beckoned, and he arrived here, and before you know it, the Civil War broke out. He did serve most, if not all, of the Civil War, and afterwards settled down, like many Texas folks at that time, in Galveston. According to family lore, he was always a risk taker, and legend has it that he was ticketed riding his horse too fast in this area or Galveston. Rest assured, that tendency to use excessive horsepower on the roads has passed through to generations and descendants such as myself. My wife and kids can attest to that. From the time of 1870 to 1900, Galveston was a boom town with the railroad building leading the way. Along with other Galveston families such as the Seeleys and Rosenbergs, Harris was involved in getting various rail lines from the port into the actual state. The nearby towns, Seeley and Rosenberg, attest to those families' commitments and involvement in the railroad boom at that point in our state's history. The 1890s was laying the seed for Imperial Sugar's development, given its soon involvement with the Galveston port. it was deemed ideal because it was fairly, not exactly, but pretty much between New Orleans and Tampico, Mexico. So the spot and location were fitting. Cotton was the leading exporter at that time. And surprisingly enough, at that point in our nation and state's history, Galveston was second only to Newport, Rhode Island in terms of income per capita at that time. So Galveston was booming at that area at that time. However, Fort Bend was very much struggling. It was known as the hellhole on the Brazos. There was gobs of mass flooding. There was instances of gambling all over the place and various examples of licentious behavior happening. So Mr. Williams started operating sugarcane in the late 19th century, and then he passed it on to the Terry Family Partnership for a short period of time, and ultimately to the Cunninghams in the late 1800s. Cunningham was instrumental in working with our family in building out the rail system so that we could get multiple spokes on the rail line and distribute the sugar quite well throughout the state and even up to Oklahoma. Obviously, 1900, most of you, if you're from Texas, know what happened. It was a tragic storm where thousands of people lost their lives and the town was decimated. At that point, Harris had passed on, and my great-grandfather was very young. He was like in his early 30s. He was the city finance commissioner. He was Ike, as I mentioned earlier. He had to pull a rabbit out of his hat given that so many properties were ruined and the population had dwindled so much. The challenge presented itself to this young man at a time when FEMA or any sort of federal aid did not exist. I do think this is a really important part of the story. In the South, obviously, as we all know, at the turn of the century, needless to say, there was a lot of racial tensions and anti-Semitism. Galveston suffered this outrageous storm tragedy, but moving forward, much more tolerance and acceptance occurred in the community. As Ike said, and we all can relate to going through a variety of recent hurricanes, tropical storms, tornadoes, whatever the case may be, those who drown together learn to live together. Amazingly enough, Ike helped with other community leaders put Galveston back together, and he met up with the Eldridge family up here in Sugar Land about 1907. They bought this sugar operation out of receivership from the Cunninghams. Mr. Eldridge was an exceptional partner from everything I can gather. He was very much boots on the ground, as Ike still spent most of his time in Galveston. He literally and figuratively was a pistol. He killed two men on two separate occasions in his life, but nevertheless was successful in his defense of his plea of self-defense both times. So 1908, Imperial's off to the races. They set up a support system for the employees, 500 new homes, medical care, a bank, company store, as well as feed and paper mills. They also paid for gravel streets with concrete curbs, gutters, sidewalks, set up a church, a school system, the whole nine yards. So it was a lot to do and a lot to be proud of. The workforce that was recruited, most of it came from towns like Schulenburg and Weimar, if not maybe further on the way to the hill country. So to this day, Sugar Land has a very interesting Czech and German heritage if you peel it that far back. So about 1915, the refinery was in operation only about 5 months out of the year, but it was still able to produce about 750,000 pounds of sugar each day. This quick growth led to the building of the Char House, the building that still stands there. So now it's about 110 years old over there on Highway 90. The 1920s came about, Imperial prospered, as a lot of businesses did. However, the 1930s came, the Great Depression occurred. At that point, Mr. Eldridge passed away, and so our whole family stepped up. And what happened was that Ike was in his 60s at that time, and some of his sons, he had 8 children total, I think three girls and 5 boys. One of the girls was my grandmother. The 5 boys, many of them were involved in the business, all hands on deck. They all were signing personal guarantees with the government. Just like in 2008, they had the TARP program for troubled businesses during the bust of 15, 16 years ago. The similar thing happened after the Depression. At that point, they all signed on to 80, 90 years ago, a $1.2 million loan. And it was like that. They had a long time to pay it off with low interest, and it did work out okay. During the war, luck was bestowed on Imperial, in World War II that is, as far as Texas and Oklahoma. It was the only supplier of sugar for these 2 states. There truly was no competition due to the government policy during the war of conserving rail cars and avoiding cross-hauling. In the late 40s, Imperial management was very heavy in advertising so it could strengthen its brand as the element of competition came back into the fold after the war. The 50s was a gilded age as output exceeded over 2 million pounds a day as the refinery became a 24/7 operation. The Galveston port was instrumental in shipping to Sugar Land about 24,000 ton cargo vessels, and those were unloaded at quicker and quicker rates. As to the town of Sugar Land, in 1959, it was incorporated with 2,500 residents, and about 45% of those folks actually worked for Imperial. In the 60s, Ike passed away, and the Jewish influence on our family waned, and the family got much more involved in civic matters, largely in Galveston. Ike was indeed much more philosophical than he was religious, and I know he was, as far as what I've read, he really did want to weave a lot of principles into his business dealings and his life. For example, the word charity derives from the Jewish concept of justice, and he would be so proud to see so many Sugar Land business leaders giving back to the community that Exchange Club advocates so firmly. As to Imperial, the late 60s brought a huge push from the marketplace for private label merchandising. For example, supermarkets such as Randall's could slap their label on sugar packages, which would actually promote their brand, not necessarily Imperial's. As to these private labels, the cost to the consumer was less. The supermarkets were able to push their own name and brand in the process. It was a bit of a necessary evil in the industry, as other competitors would have jumped at the chance, even if it meant lower profits. As the 70s rolled around, so much of the sugar was being imported, thus the land of the refinery was sold to house builders and developers. I think Sugar Creek was the first development around 1970, and then the internationally recognized architect and developer Gerald Hines, who actually put together the Houston Galleria about the same time, if not prior, he came down and worked out a deal to develop the community of Sweetwater, and he built the first Colony Mall. As to business, the 1980s, the clouds started appearing. The company had hit a peak of 4 million pounds of sugar each day, but the changes in the marketplace were coming at us fast and furious. About at least half the business Imperial had was with mass producers such as Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, Nabisco, General Mills, and the advent of liquid high fructose corn syrup in 1986, give or take, was the beginning of the end, as it could be produced much quicker, more cost effective, and the marketing campaigns of other sweeteners such as Sweet and Low helped bring sudden challenges to Imperial. Nevertheless, the management was very shrewd and developed a strategy of acquiring sugar beet producers out in the west, often mountain states, to offset the loss of revenue. The beet producers historically had obtained a significant advantage in terms of quotas, tariffs, and that kind of thing with Congress as compared to the sugarcane brethren. It was management's goal to diversify away from the risk of being dependent on sugarcane providers, and simultaneously Imperial doubles its size with just one acquisition of the large sugar company out of Colorado Springs known as Holly Sugar. The 1989 acquisition led to the name of Imperial Holly. While the strategy of diversifying away from sugarcane to at least a partial supply of beet sugar did pay off in the marketplace, the corn syrup competition presented continual challenges. So in 1997, for reasons that included more diversification in like pre-packaged sweeteners, we acquired Savannah Foods out of Georgia. If y'all are from the East Coast, their brand is primarily, was, and I think to this day still is, Dixie Crystals. That acquisition, in combining with the previous ones, made Imperial the world's largest sugar company. That lasted 4 years, but in 2001, after that acquisition, Imperial was in bankruptcy. Ultimately, it was a byproduct of increased debt from the two acquisitions, the previous 12 or so years, and lower sales for refined sugar in the marketplace, consumer preferences, and simply higher energy costs. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the refinery ceased operations, and most of the jobs that have been in Sugar Land moved to Savannah, Georgia, to the best of my knowledge. In 2012, I believe the Lewis Dreyfus Commodity Group took ownership of the Imperial brand, and it's still out in the marketplace. I checked yesterday as to where it's being made when I went to HEB, and it's being made currently and produced in Minnesota and packaged up there, of all places. Anyhow, even though the stock took a nosedive, Imperial has meant more to my cousins and myself than words can describe. As Ike would have wanted, it has opened the doors to a community-minded, philanthropic approach to various endeavors in our life. One memory I have is that must have been the mid-'80s at an annual stockholders meeting over there by the Char House in 90 in the executive offices. my grandmother insisted that we learn more about giving back, charity, and simply asked us how would we define philanthropy? And as a word, I guess a lot of words I didn't know at that time, but I definitely did not know that one, and I couldn't really begin to take a stab at it. I had maybe a hint, but if you really peel it back, the word philanthropy has a very simple, basic definition. In the Latin, phil means love, and anthropy, as we all know, means mankind. The spirit of Imperial Sugar had philanthropy woven into it well before these exchange clubs started, much less grown to the size that 5 or 6 of them are now in Fort Bend County, which, if you look at the exchange club map, it's really a testament to the people like Doug and Bob that he referenced. The founders of the spirit of these clubs that goes back 30 and 40 years is remarkable, and it's really neat to be a part of it as a kid then, in a way, and as an adult now. Anyhow, another memory I have is the idiosyncratic tendency I had years ago to embrace. When I was in college, I'd read the financials. Don't ask me why, but I really was appreciative of the spirit in which I knew times were tough then, and the focus was on the jobs. The narrative from the executives was, we're having a hard time, we're going to keep jobs. The dignity in which exchange members try to treat folks was definitely over there at Imperial. So it's been a special history lesson for everyone. In retrospect, my great-great-grandfather Ike and his sons applied the exchange covenant of service into the development of the Imperial's labor workforce for about 100 years. Not to wax poetic, and that's why I passed out the covenant of service. Hopefully the non-members have one. At the end of each weekly meeting that Doug talked about, we have the gospel, and what we call the gospel, really it's the covenant of service. And it's really a special time of the meeting. And the action verbs in there I just love. It talks about accepting the divine privilege, consecrating your best energies, discharging the debt, and so on and so forth. So much of the credit for Imperial's legacy goes to the many families who work there, often second or third generations. And they would have been great exchangites too. Families such as the Louviers, the Hannahs, the Anheisers, Bob Brown's extended family, and so many more were the backbone of the sugar and utility companies of this area, without a doubt. So in closing, there's a few things I'd like to say. The story of Father Harris and son Ike is ultimately a very, very rare Southern story of not one but 2 small Texas towns' acceptance of Jewish men and their families. Something during their lives was much, much more the exception than the rule of thumb. There's a family tale that's passed through the generations of a KKK rally happening during very tense times in Galveston, I believe, say 1914, about the start of World War I. The community was obviously stressed, and the concern was this KKK rally was going to get out of hand. So, what do you know, various faith leaders met up, including 2 Texas legends, Methodist pastor Kerwin from Galveston and Jewish Rabbi Cohen, along with an Episcopalian priest. They simply decided to get all the community together behind them, and the 3 leaders marched together arm in arm through the park where the KKK rally was. And what do you know? The rally disbanded. Problem solved. The bottom line is both Galveston and Sugar Land have embraced diversity in very unique, exceptional ways then and up to today. And here we are, the 5th most diverse county in the country. We all should take an incredible amount of pride in that, and we are lucky beneficiaries of actions of the previous families I've mentioned. As to being a member of Exchange for 10 years, it's been a sincere privilege. This is only our 2nd annual fundraiser, these flags behind us. And to my knowledge, unless someone wants to correct me, we're the only exchange club in the country, when there's hundreds of them, that has not one, but 2 fundraisers that raise 6 digits each. And to get that momentum so quickly is really a testament to all the members, without a doubt. And please remember, you non-members, the money, there's no paid staff. It all gets recycled back into worthy causes here in Fort Bend County. Lastly, as to heroes, I saw something ironically online the other day that mentioned back about 80 to 90 years ago in the 30s, people would spend, as far as their waking time, an average combined 70% on one of 4 things. They'd be at school or work, or with friends, or with family, or with their neighbors. That was then. 75% of folks' time, 70% of their time awake was on a combination of those 4 things. Today, unfortunately, one thing consumes 61% of our time when we're awake. That's being online, either on a phone or a computer. And so it's really a challenge It's really not a surprise why one is to wonder why kids today face so many emotional hurdles. Clubs like Exchange mitigate against this, and in person do our best to recognize heroes of all stripes. There are so many heroes amongst us exhibiting the simple traits of courage or other noble qualities, and we want and need more participation from all age levels in years ahead to continue to grow this wonderful event and this wonderful club. As to this field of honor, this is our second year, and our goal was 1776 flags. Thank you, Pete Olson. I'm glad to say that we've exceeded it. Our goal last year, we exceeded it this year. I mentioned earlier, a few minutes ago, that the town of Sugar Land was incorporated in the late 50s with 2,500 residents to start, with a huge chunk of those folks working at Imperial. Those 2,500 initial residents of Sugar Land are my heroes, and let's make it a goal to turbocharge our collective efforts to get 2,500 flags sold come November 2025 to recognize the local heroes, the first responders, the veterans, any kind of hero that our community sees fit. It would only be fitting. Thank y'all very much.